prisoner of war for 13 months. So I appreciate the chance to share this. I've talked about it in sermons and I've done other things with it, but I've never really sat like this and talked with a group about it all. And so bear with me on this if it gets a little rough at times or if I seem to get wander. I'm a sort of a history geek, and so there's a danger that I will go into the weeds at times, and so I'll try not to do that. But if you all yawn in unison, I'll know to back off and come back. The 8th Air Force. Let me give you a sense of the 8th Air Force. This is World War II, and the Army Air Corps is really a part of the United States Army. There is no Air Force at that point. It was the Army Air Corps, and the 8th Air Force was stationed in East Anglia, England, and it was the biggest and most active of all of the different Air Force groups for the United States, running missions into Europe and Germany. And I think I could hold this up and give you a little bit of a sense. This is a map of East Anglia with all of the different air bases for the 8th Air Force. And just to give you a sense of how many air bases there were scattered across East Anglia there in England. England, in a sense, became a kind of a great airport for American forces. And they ran a ton of missions out of there. And I can only imagine what it must have been like for folks to see these airplanes in the sky, because there were times when there were, for some of my father's missions, there were 700 aircraft in the sky. These would go on for miles, this train of planes heading over toward Germany. And I can only imagine, we'll never see that kind of thing again, those numbers. And I can only imagine what it must have been like to look up and see these planes going overhead. There's a marvelous book. The author's last name is Miller, but the book is called Masters of the Air, and it tells the story of the 8th Air Force. And it is a really well done book. It's a great history book in that it tells a lot of stories of individuals while also giving you a very good sense of the big picture of the air war. So if you're interested, that's a good book to read. They are actually turning that into a series soon. If any of you remember Band of Brothers or The Pacific, that told the story of the airborne troops in World War II and then the Pacific War. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks produced that. And now they are doing a series, just getting ready to start filming a series based on the air crews in Europe called Masters of the Air, based on that book. So that should be really interesting when that day comes. Andy Rooney, if y'all remember Andy Rooney, the writer. He was a war correspondent, a writer, and then of course on 60 Minutes for years and years. He said this, he said, the 8th Air Force was one of the great fighting forces in the history of warfare. It had the best equipment and the best men, all but a handful of whom were civilian Americans, educated and willing to fight for their country and a cause they understood was in danger. Freedom is what made World War II special. And of course, what marks World War II is the incredible mobilization of people across the United States and how many young men and women, but mostly men, fought in the war. And an incredible number. I mean, there's not a family that didn't have someone over there. There's not a town that didn't have a number of young men who'd gone off to war in all of the different branches. It truly was a civilian army that the United States rallied in World War II. And the scope of the war was tremendous. So the 8th Air Force was our Air Corps in Europe, and they were practicing something very different. The British had been bombing Germany for a while, but always at night. All of their raids were at night. And so the 8th Air Force came with the hope of doing what they called precision daylight bombing. And this is that they would go in broad daylight into Germany, into France, wherever they needed to go. And they would try to bomb with precision. They had the Norwich bomb site, which was more accurate. It's still not as nearly as precise as what we can do today, of course. but they were daylight raids. And so these men were rather vulnerable up there during all that time. It is interesting to note that the 8th Air Force, by the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had more fatal casualties, 26,000, than the entire United States Marine Corps. That's kind of a sobering statistic. When I think of the Marine Corps and what they went through in the Pacific, it is hard to imagine that there were more men killed in the 8th Air Force than in the Marine Corps. And here's another rather staggering statistic as far as casualties go. And casualties, of course, include not only the killed, but the wounded and the captured. 77% of the Americans who flew against the Reich before D-Day wound up as casualties. 77% casualty rate before D-Day. And that was, my father was included in that number. The air crews had a unique experience, of course. Every branch of the military in World War II had its own unique horrors and challenges. You can only, you think about the infantry in the mud and the muck, seeing their enemy face to face sometimes, and also going through artillery barrages. You had the Navy on the ships facing danger. I can think of nothing more horrifying than to imagine being on a Navy ship and being sunk in the middle of the ocean. The air crews had their own unique challenges and terrors in their missions. First, it was tremendously cold. Let me back up and just say, the two heavy bombers of World War II were the B-24 Liberator and the B-17 Flying Fortress. They had crews of 10 men, gunners and navigator and radio man and bombardier and pilot and co-pilot. And my father flew on a B-17. It was a more sophisticated plane than the B-24. My father and others of their ilk joked that the B-24s were made out of the boxes that the B-17s came in. They didn't have a lot of respect for the B-24, but they were called the heavies, the heavy bombers. And they are the ones who did the bombing runs along with fighters later in the war over Europe. They flew at high altitudes, sometimes 30,000 feet, and they had no heat in those airplanes. So they had some electric heat under their air suits, full thick wool and sheepskin air suits. But it could get down to 40 degrees below zero in those planes. So that's numbing and terrifying in itself. You had to check your oxygen every once in a while to make sure it didn't freeze up. The condensation from the air would freeze up. Men lost consciousness and died at times from that. So that was a reality. You had long flights, sometimes 9-10 hours in the air, round trip. So there was long periods of boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. You had the fighters who came after them, but as my father said, the fighters weren't as terrifying because you could shoot back at a fighter. They had their guns and they shot back. But what was truly terrifying for the air crews was the anti-aircraft, the flak. You're flying through this flak, this 88s that the Germans used for anti-aircraft. The explosives are going off around the planes. They would key in on the altitude and the course, and the Germans would send up the flak. And it was pure chance. It either hit you or it didn't. There's not a thing you can do about it. You either get hit by the flak or you don't. And so there was that sheer terror of chance. And plus, you're feeling the shock waves from the flak, from the anti-aircraft. Sometimes that flak would come through, the shrapnel would come through the planes. My father's plane came back from one mission. This is not the one when he went down. Came back with 107 holes in the plane from anti-aircraft. It was sheer terror for those men. And some men cracked, it was just too much, but very few. And that's the other remarkable thing about war is men go through horrible, horrible things, but very few really crack. And it has to do with the men around you. It has to do with fighting with the men who are around you and fighting for them. And this camaraderie, I think, is what kept men going through stuff that nobody would want to experience ever in their lives. So that was sort of the the sense of it. Oh, by the way, the most terrifying part of the mission was when you were over the target, because once they were over the target, they had to fly flat, level, and straight. And so actually, when you got over the target, the bombardier took over the plane and was actually controlling it from the bomb site. And there's nothing you can do there but just fly straight over the target. And so the flak and all is coming up, and you're waiting, waiting, waiting for the bombs to drop so that the airplane can turn, go back into the clouds, find shelter, and get away and move away. So I want to talk a little bit about the time period in which my father flew. He started flying in February of 44. And this was in time for the busiest time of the air war and the most dangerous time of the air war. He flew 13 missions, was shot down on the 13th mission. From February through April 11th, I'm sorry. This was a time during the war when they were really gearing up in preparation for D-Day and the invasion of Europe. And so they were bombing targets, of course, military targets, transportation targets, industrial areas, and especially anything associated with the air war. But what is the truth of the matter is that these heavy bomb crews by March of 1944, they were bait. They were really just bait. By then, you had the P-51s, the Mustangs that were long-range fighters. So finally, the air crews had fighter escorts all the way to their targets into deep Germany. And the intention at that point was to draw the Luftwaffe up in the air and then shoot them down. They wanted to eliminate the Air Force, the German Air Force, in preparation for D-Day. And so the men on the bombers were targets. They were just bait, in essence. One thing I read said that this is from Masters of the Air, for the remainder of March and into April, Spatz and Doolittle continued to force the fight, sending out heavies, those are the big bombers, on immense radar raids, baiting missions actually, in blinding weather sometimes, that made accurate bombing impossible. In April alone, the 8th Air Force lost 409 heavy bombers, the most it would lose in any single month in the air war. 409 crews went down in April of 1944. That's 10 men on each of those planes. And as well as fighters, there were a number of fighters shot down also. And they were being used basically as bait to try to destroy the Luftwaffe. So missions that they would not have taken earlier in the war, or even a month earlier when the weather was bad, they are now taking because they wanted to get the Luftwaffe up in the air. The first mission on Berlin was in March, and my father flew on that. The first American mission on Berlin was March 6th, 1944, and my father was in that. And the goal in bombing Berlin was to hit strategic targets there, of course, but also the Luftwaffe was squadroned especially around Berlin. So going to Berlin drew up more fighters and that they could shoot down. And so they kept flying missions to Berlin, even when the air crews believed that they really weren't accomplishing anything strategic in that. They kept sending missions to Berlin because they wanted to shoot down the aircraft. It became brutal, you know, I mean, this is war. And winning was costly. And so men's lives were put at risk in order to do what was strategically best. It is hard for us to imagine the scope and of the suffering in World War II also, for most of us who don't have any memory of that. And so the scope of suffering, the scope of casualties was tremendous. There's a story that Miller Donald Miller tells in Masters of the Air. It says they were going to Berlin again. It was a 1,100-mile round trip from Eastern England, which meant the bombers would be exposed over central Germany for 5 hours. And if the bad weather prevailed, would have to fly over a 6-mile high cloud bank and would make formation flying difficult. When Doolittle's chief aide urged that the Liberators, the B-24s, not be sent because fully loaded, they could not fly as high as the B-17s. The man said to the commander, Anderson, he said, God, the crews, the men will just get killed in them, in the B-24s. That's all that's going to happen. They're just going to get killed. And the commander had a one-word response. His response was, well, and that was it. This was the cost that was necessary to destroy the Luftwaffe. And so these men were sent up into almost impossible situations. So we come to April 1944, and this is where I want to share with you my father's story a bit more. Let me first show you quickly the really good picture that I have of my father. I don't have here, it's up in LJ, but this is a shot of him from a group picture. So you can at least see him in his aircrew uniform. Can you see that? I hope that's coming across there. And this is a picture of him with his crew, a copy of a photo that we have elsewhere of him and his crew. 10 men, as I said, were on every B-17. 6 of them were gunners, 4 of them were officers, and the 4 officers were pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator. They were all, by the way, sergeants. You might notice that in the air war, you didn't have any privates unless they were on the ground, maybe. And there was a reason for that, is that if you are captured, the Germans by the Geneva Convention could not force officers or non-commissioned officers to work as slave labor. So everybody who flew on a B-17 was either a technical sergeant or a staff sergeant. And that way, when they were captured, they did not have to do the manual labor that other prisoners sometimes had to do. So we are to April 1944. On April 9th, they had a mission to Poznan, Poland. It was one of the most brutal missions of the war. And they were bombed there again to draw the Luftwaffe also. The next day, they were not able to fly because of weather. Then April 11th, they were sent to Poznan, Poland again, and the same target. Again, the target was overcast, so they went to a secondary target in Rostock, Germany. They were hit badly by anti-aircraft fire there, flak. The plane was damaged, was hit seriously. They lost some of the controls, lost an engine and one landing gear, and there was a fire on board. But other than that, everything was fine. So the pilot turned, and he actually tried to go to Sweden. They're up on that northern coast, up on the Baltic. He tried to go to Sweden because Sweden is a neutral country. There they would have been interned and not captured as prisoners. He tried to go to Sweden, but saw that he couldn't make it and turned back. While they were still over the water, they were hit by some fighters. And at that point, my father was hit. He was in the tail gun position, the back of the plane, and a shell came in over his left shoulder, and from the fighter, a 20 millimeter gun shell, went over his shoulder and hit the little glass front that was right in front of him. It's bulletproof glass, so when it hit that, pieces of the glass and the bullet shattered and sprayed back on him. He had wounds in his face, in his eye, in his shoulder, and in his knees. He was also knocked unconscious. So he is lying now on the floor of the plane. The navigator of the crew had also been hit, probably by the flak, and was probably dead by then, but they were trying to manage his wounds. The pilot realized he's not going to make it to Sweden. So they crash land on a little German island called Fehmarn, off the coast of Germany. He tried to do a controlled crash landing and did the best he could, but it was a hard hit, needless to say. And they ended up hitting a little wall. The navigator actually was thrown out of the plane. My father, who was unconscious, rolled forward through the compartment of the plane, tumbled upward into the front of the plane, and then came to there. By the way, when they were up in the air and they saw that they were about to crash land, the pilot tried to contact everyone on the intercom, and my dad and the navigator did not respond. He sent my father's best friend, Al Gregson, back to check on my father, and Al found my father covered in blood, unconscious, lying there, and assumed he was dead, actually. He went back to his place. And when they crashed, he tumbled up through the front. He came to there, and they were captured almost immediately. Several of the men were wounded. Al Gregson, my father's best friend, had a 20 millimeter shell cut his back, which tells you how close he was to being killed. The ball turret gunner was wounded in the hip. The engineer was wounded by flak in his hand, and the navigator was killed. They were taken to a naval camp nearby, stayed there overnight. When they were captured almost immediately. They were allowed at that naval camp to bury the navigator. I want to stop there for just a second and digress. I've never known much about the navigator. Norderer was his name, Charles Norderer. And the truth is, my father did not know him very well because he was fairly new to the crew. He had been an addition to the crew, a replacement. And so I looked him up online this week because I'd never really known anything about him. And I was able to find a couple of things about him. One, that he had already had one plane go out from under him. They were involved in a crash right after takeoff, and all the men had to parachute out. He made it through that, obviously. He was engaged to be married in December of 43. I don't know, I can't find that he got married, actually. But he was engaged to be married. And then he was 24 years old when he was killed. You think about World War II and how many young men were killed at that age or younger. That's pretty old, actually, for an aircrew, 24. Being a navigator would probably make sense that he'd be a little bit older. My father was 23 and was one of the older guys in the crew. I found there's an interesting site, by the way, if you ever want to research someone. It's called Find a Grave, which is a weird title, but you can find people's graves if someone has entered it and taken pictures of it. And I found his grave. They obviously moved his body to the United States. He was from Ohio. He had 9 siblings. One of those siblings died at age 3. All the others survived him and lived. The oldest sister died in 2008. So I just wanted to pause. And, here's just one person, one casualty of the war on my father's aircrew. But he had a life and he had a family, and it is an interesting snapshot of what so many families went through during that war, and any war for that matter. Let me tell you a couple other quick stories of some other men during this time frame. There were some friends of my father's. I met them at the Stalag 17 reunions. Pappy Gregson, it's called Pappy. It sounds like a war movie. And I've told this story in a sermon that I preached here, but he and his best friend was Bob, and they were on a B-24 while they were up on a mission around that same time, in that heaviest time of the war. They were hit by a fighter, and a 20 millimeter shell went through Bob's leg. He was bleeding. It was going to bleed out. There was nothing they could do. They had a long way to go before getting back to England. And so they put a tourniquet on his leg, and they opened up his parachute, and they rolled him out of the plane. And he floated down to earth. He was found by the Germans, and he lived. He and Pappy were reunited in the prison camp not long after that, because the plane went down, I believe, on the same mission. And Pappy was on that mission, and the plane ended up going down. They had to bail out. Quick story there. One of the airmen, one of the crew members said, "No, I ain't going to bail out." The thought of jumping out of the airplane apparently was just too much for him. And they said to him, Pappy said to him, "You got to jump." He said, "No, I'll ride it down." "Well, there's no riding it down. This plane is going to crash." "No, I ain't jumping." So basically, make a long story short, he just had to punch him, slug him, and throw him out of the plane to get him to live. So, and he made it. One other quick story of a guy I met at the Stalag 17 reunion. There was a man who was a waist gunner on the B-17. Those are the windows on the sides of the planes, open windows that they fired the 50 caliber machine guns through. He was flying along and suddenly was thrown out of the plane, went through that window. Now he has a chute on, but he's falling backwards from the plane. The pressure pulled his boots off, he said. And as he was falling back from the plane, he looked up and his plane disintegrated. It just exploded, a direct hit. That's what threw him out of the plane. And 9 men were gone in an instant. And he was the sole survivor. And I've always thought about him, what was that like to live your life after that when everyone else on your plane has died? Amazing stories of these guys. So my father was captured. They were taken first to Hamburg, Germany, which was the nearest large city. And as he describes it, Hamburg was still smoking and there were still fires from the British bombing the night before. The civilians hated the airmen because of that. They took these guys, these 9 guys, and put them in the jail, in the jail there in Hamburg. And they left the lights on all night and they left the doors open so that civilians could come in. And so people came in all through the night, spit on them, cursed them, threw things at them in order to vent their rage. They were then taken to a place called Dulag Luft near Frankfurt. That was the main interrogation center for the Germans, for the air crews who came through. They were kept there for several days. He was in an individual cell, 7 by 10 feet. He said the light stayed on 24 hours a day and his cell was very hot. They were taken out at odd times, erratic times, unscheduled times for interrogation. And the idea was to get whatever they could out of these air crews. The air crews were trained, name and serial number only. They'd use different tactics. One guy would be really nice and try to strike up a conversation. Another one would come in and threaten them. And so they alternated on, their approach. They did not torture them. There was no torture involved for these men. My father never would answer anything. They finally gave him a piece of paper to fill out, which would have given their air crew, their base, their unit. And my father refused to fill that out too at the very end. And he said what they were trying to do was piece together a picture of the 8th Air Force from that. They threatened that if you don't sign this, we're not going to notify your family. Your family won't know where you are and what happened to you. They did not sign it. My father talks about how right toward the end, before they were moved on from the interrogation center, he was allowed to go out into a little yard and walk around a little bit. And there was another American there and he started talking to him. And then he realized, oh, wait, this might not be an American. This might be a plant. And so he quit talking, but he found out later he was indeed another prisoner. This is the telegram. This is just a photocopy of the telegram that was sent to my father's father upon his missing in action. And y'all have probably heard telegrams like this. It says, the Secretary of War desires me to express his deepest regret that your son, Staff Sergeant Dan E. Westmoreland, has been reported missing in action since 11 April over Germany. If further details or other information are received, you will be promptly notified. My Aunt Rosalind, who is my Uncle Bill's wife said that when my father's father received that letter, that he walked down the streets in LJ wailing, wailing in grief that his son was missing. And of course, later they found out that he was a POW. But for a while, and it was quite a while, they did not know, and which was typical of all these, these men. My father was, after being at the interrogation center for a while, he was, all of the prisoners were loaded up on boxcars, basically cattle cars. And they had a guard in the car with you, 30 men or so in these cars, no toilet facilities, no bed. And they were taken to across all the way into Austria. This was a number of days that they were on this train. They traveled only at night because during the daytime, the Americans would strafe or bomb the trains. And so this was a long, arduous, painful trip. They arrived in Krems, Austria, Stalag 17B, it was called. Any of you, I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen the movie Stalag 17 with William Holden. It's a good movie, actually. It's a really good movie. It was written by a man who was a prisoner. It was a play first on Broadway and then a movie. And it was written by a man who was a prisoner at Stalag 17. It's a good movie. If you've never seen it, it's a classic. I recommend it. But this is the same place, Stalag 17B. And my father talked about the feeling of walking toward that camp. This is it. I mean, this is a prison camp. You're looking at the fence, the wires, the guard towers, the barracks beyond that. And he said the one thing that helped his feelings was, as he was walking toward the fence line, someone inside yelled, "Hey, there's Westmoreland." And it was someone that he had trained with, who recognized him. And so that lifted his spirits, that, here are people I know here too. And so I found a number of guys, of course, that he had known inside the camp. They were put into barracks. The barracks were built for people, about 240 men. They often held about 400 men. He was put in a new barrack, and the new barracks were even simpler than the older barracks. There was no toilet facility in there. There was no showers in there. They were packed in. They lived in 3 levels of bunks there. Because these camps were getting to be really overcrowded because so many air crews were being shot down, that they were really having to pack these men into the camps. Now, Stalag 17B also included other nationalities. I think there were as many as 10 nationalities in different sections of the camp. And there was a Russian camp right next to it. And the Russians were treated horrendously. Germans and Russians hated each other. The Germans had been monstrous toward the Russians in Russia during the invasion. The Russians were equally monstrous to the Germans when they invaded Germany later. But the Russian prisoners were not treated with the same care as the American and British. They were given a burlap bag, and there was a pile of straw, and he filled the bag with straw, and that was his mattress for the next year. They were given, his blanket was what looked like 2 pieces of, he said, looked like 2 pieces of draperies, curtains. And neither was long enough to cover his body. So he had to cover his lower half with one blanket and his upper half with the other. It was so cold. They had one pot-bellied stove in these barracks for all of these men. It was so cold that the men shared bunks. They just slept together in these bunks, so as to keep each other warm, basically. And I believe my father slept with his friend Al Gregson. They shared a bunk there in that place. They were given 2 pairs of socks, a pair of wooden shoes, 2 washcloths, a towel, a china bowl, an aluminum spoon, a tube of tooth powder, a razor and 5 blades, a comb, and a toothbrush when they entered the camp. And that's pretty much what they had. He said that the china bowl broke almost immediately. Almost all of their dishware that they had, any cups or anything they had, were made from the cans from the Red Cross packages. Let me say a little bit about the Red Cross packages. The idea was that American prisoners would receive one package per week. One man would receive one package from the Red Cross each week. That was never the case. You could go months without a package. And part of that was because the transportation was so bad. The simple fact was the Germans couldn't transport it there. They were being bombed. And so you often did not receive these. When they did, the Red Cross packages included a D-bar, which was a chocolate bar, hard chocolate. And that became the sort of the currency for the camp. The value of something was stated in D-bars. That's worth 3 D-bars, pack of cigarettes, 2 D-bars, whatever. And so that was the, he said it was so hard you really couldn't bite into it. You just sort of gnawed on it. But it gave you energy, you know, it was helpful. Let's see. Also in the Red Cross package was a kind of precursor to instant coffee. It was a sort of soluble coffee. So it came in 2-ounce cans. The coffee would absorb moisture and turn into a solid chunk, which you then scraped with the top of a can into boiling water. They called it brew. Their coffee was called brew, and it tasted like coffee, but that's about it, you know. There was also a can of salmon, which was, as you might imagine, valuable to these men. But the Germans always stabbed the cans with a bayonet before they gave to the men. That way you couldn't store up this stuff to use in escape. And so they plugged the holes on the cans with margarine. And he said, we learned how long this could last. He said if the edges of the hole started to turn blue, he said you had to eat it that day. That was as long as that salmon was going to last. So they did not get a lot of Red Cross packages, but obviously when they did, it was good news. You know, it was at least a help. Mostly they ate barley soup and some potatoes. They didn't have much to eat. They were divided into little groups, and so different men would go and prepare the the food and bring it back. And the Germans gave them some barley. He said a really great meal was barley soup with some of the brown sugar from the Red Cross. That was his favorite meal. The next was boiled potatoes, was his next favorite meal. They were hungry. He said at first you're feeling the pangs of hunger, but then after a while the pangs go away, and there's just this sort of sense that you need food, you know, of being deprived of food. They didn't have much water. Toward the end of the war, the water was only turned on 1 hour at a time, twice a day. He had 2 showers in his entire time that year, 13 months that he was a prisoner. Water was in short supply. They did shave, he said. He said, sometimes I wonder, and they had guys who would cut their hair. He said, I wondered sometimes why we shaved. And looking back on it, why did we shave? Because we're military men and we thought we should, you know, that was what we're supposed to do. He said he found himself, they all found themselves missing the simple things, a thing like fingernail clippers, something just to be able to groom yourself a little bit more. So in the camp, there was a library because they had books that had come from YMCA and the Red Cross. And my father was a voracious reader, so he worked in the library. Let me show you a couple things here real quick. These were what he was able to write from, let's see, there you go. This was a note. They were allowed to write on these little envelopes. It was shipped through the Red Cross and eventually would make it to their home. This was to his sister, Helen Fields in LJ. And he received, I'm not sure he ever got any mail from his family. I'm sure they sent him mail, but it would take at best, you would receive mail from the United States after 3 months. All of these things had to go through censors in America, censors in Germany. Then it had to make it to the camp, which was not always the case. Let me read you a little bit of what he wrote in some of these. June 17th, 1944. This is after he was captured. He was captured in April. He said, "Hello, folks." He says, "It's Saturday night and no place to go. I hope that everyone is well. I am in excellent health and spirits. I hope that this isn't your first letter from me, but if so, I suffered no serious injuries and I'm 100% okay now. Only the good die young. Hello to the kids. Love, Dan." The kids, by the way, that was Leanne's mother and another nephew, Billy Fields, I believe. This one was longer. I'm not quite sure what merited this, but this was in October. He said, in this letter, a note here, he always asked in almost every one of these, he said, "Save Life magazines for me." He wanted, when he got home, whenever that day was, he wanted to be able to go through the Life magazines. And he said, "Any newspapers you think I might like." He always talked about the fact that he was able to read some books there. And he volunteered in the library, by the way. And there was a guy from Tennessee who saw him reading one day. And he said to him, "I've never read a book." The guy had never read an entire book. So my father gave him The Robe, the classic book, The Robe. He said, "Read this." And the guy read the book, he said. He came back to him and he said, "That was incredible. That was an incredible experience." He said, "But I never want to do it again." So for whatever reason, the guy, it was too much for him. He never wanted to read another book. This I thought was a little bit poignant here. He says, "Don't let the kids forget me." He's talking about his niece and nephew. He said, "I have their pictures here with me. Everyone write me if possible. I hope you have received other mail from me. Just in case, Merry Christmas. And everybody take care of them. Everybody take care of themselves. Love, Dan." That was in October of 44. I have several of those letters from him. At one point, Leanne, he said, actually, I think this was when he was in England. He talked about the fact that he'd heard that Helen Jane was sick. So he was trying to check on her. So they were imprisoned there for the 13 months, my father was. Then come March. At the end of March, they were sure that they would soon be freed because they could hear the artillery, the Russian artillery over in Vienna. And so he knew that the liberation was coming. Everyone knew that. But then one day, he said, they were told that they were leaving in 1 hour. Okay. I want to back up and just say one other thing. Every day they had their roll calls. They were brought out. After the assassination attempt on Hitler in July of 44, conditions got worse for the prisoners. Not quite sure why. I guess they were trying to punish whoever they could. And they were brought out of the barracks regularly and often. And things were searched, though they had no clue what they were really looking for. So the conditions worsened after July when the assassination attempt was carried out. So this is March now, 45. They were told to be ready in an hour. They came out and they started marching these men west. They did not want to be captured by the Russians. The guards did not. And so the 500 men who were the sickest were left behind in the camp for the Russians to liberate. 4,000 men were taken out of the camp and marched west. They marched in groups of, I think it was 8 groups of 500 men, and they marched them west. And they simply walked across the countryside, roughly along, I think, the Danube River, heading toward Germany, across Austria. They walked for 18 days. Wherever they were at the end of the day, that's where they slept, in the countryside. He said he slept in a barn 2 nights at that time. Otherwise, they were walking along. They had little food from the Germans. They scavenged for food. And in fact, on April 15th, I think it was, my father and another guy were, April 12th, he said a friend and he were trying to steal some onions across a fence, and a French worker. Now, remember, the Germans used forced labor from across Europe. And this French worker was there. And the French worker saw these Americans and said, "Monsieur, your great American president is dead." And that's how they learned that Franklin Roosevelt had died 3 days earlier. And he always remembered that. He remembered that. They marched across the countryside. When they finally reached around Braunau, Germany, they were stopped there at the river, and they built some lean-tos there out of pine straw and waited, pine branches, and waited for 3 more days. And that's when some Americans came along, floated a raft across the river, and officially liberated them. So they were liberated on on May 3rd. The war ended a week later. After they were liberated, they were taken to an aluminum factory, an abandoned aluminum factory, where they stayed for a few days there. He said when they finally got some food in there, the cook prepared them a huge meal, these prisoners of war, that included corned beef hash, a huge meal. Well, it's the last thing these guys needed. Of course, they gorged themselves, and they ate, and they were then violently sick. They all became, very, very sick. That's when the cook disappeared, he said. And from then on, they fed them very small portions and several times a day, and very, very simple food. They were taken on to another camp. They were put on planes then and flown to France. And there was a camp called Camp Lucky Strike there, where all the ex-POWs were brought to be cared for. And they were fumigated. They had hot showers there, and they could get hot chocolate. I actually have a picture. These are men lined up at Camp Lucky Strike for hot chocolate. And he said they kept that place open, that little spot there for the hot chocolate, open 24 hours a day. And he said there was always a line because it was such a delicacy to have some hot chocolate. And so they stayed there for several weeks, and then were brought home after that. A couple other really quick notes. I know we're right at the time to finish here. One, the guards, the German guards, varied as you might expect. Anyone given that kind of power, there were sadistic guards, but then there were also kind guards. And one of my father's favorite memories from the prison camp, in fact, was one day, and I want to say it was near Christmas, one of the guards walked up to him and handed him a boiled egg. And it was just an act of kindness. That was all. It was just, for whatever reason, the man gave him an egg. And he never forgot that. So my father never blamed the Germans for his ill health or anything, because he said by the time they were there, the Germans didn't have much to eat either. And so they understood what was going on. They were not tortured. This was not like the prisoners of the Japanese. They were treated fairly well, although none of his wounds were ever treated. And there were times when they could be cruel. And like I said, after the assassination attempt, conditions changed drastically. The other thing I want to mention from his experience was that during that march across Germany, they passed Mauthausen. Mauthausen was his group passed Mauthausen. It was a concentration camp. Mauthausen was a little different as concentration camps go, because it was really not Jews so much, although I'm sure there were Jews in the camp. It was mostly political prisoners and intellectuals, but it was a concentration camp just the same. My father and his friends talked about that finally, that experience of Mauthausen at one of their reunions. Someone finally said, "We should talk about Mauthausen." He had never told me about it until after this. They had to stay outside that camp for a couple of days on this march. He said he never forgot the smell of the place. And there were bodies stacked at that concentration camp. He saw one man, an older German, who was on a two-wheeled wagon, attached to a horse. The Germans were trying to get out of there before they were captured. This man backed this wagon up over the bodies of the dead there, like they were logs, my father said. Those images and that experience stayed with those men for the rest of their lives. That is one of the things about these veterans, from World War II. It was only years later that my father came to understand the term post-traumatic stress syndrome. They had never talked about that. Men came home from World War II and they went back to work. They were just expected to go back to work. But all of them had their own wounds and their own psychic wounds. And they carried them, and their families dealt with it. Their wives, my mother, dealt with my father's psychic wounds for years. And it was only later that they were sort of allowed the space to talk through those things. I want to tell a story from another guy. As I said, World War II was brutal, and the strategy and the tactics were brutal. And toward the end of the war, it was decided that the German people needed to suffer more for what they had done in World War II. I had a great guy at the church at Embry Hills who, like my father, was on a B-17. He was a radio man on B-17. And he was there later than my father and flew right up to the end of the war. He told me about a mission. He said they were loaded up in their planes. They did not have a briefing ahead of time. They always had briefings for these missions. He said they were given the orders after they left the ground. They were told to open the orders after they left. And the order was to bomb Berlin. And the order was to bomb civilian areas of Berlin. And Harold, who was a tough old guy, good guy, gruff guy, he never forgot that. They flew to Berlin, and he said, we flew in low. And he said he could see the people on the streets below, civilians, as they did their bombing run there in Berlin. And it was an intentional act to punish the German people. We don't think of ourselves that way, but that was the war. This was a horrible war. And that haunted Harold for the rest of his life, that mission to bomb civilians in Berlin. So all of that simply to say, a remarkable generation of people that went through these things and then came home and raised families and went back to life. And I admire these guys. I was thankful that I got to know some of the pre-OWs through the reunion groups with my father. And I will always be thankful for what they went through for us, for our sakes. But anyway, that's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to share with you. There are other things, but hopefully you're still conscious. So I don't know if anybody had any comments or questions quickly. I know we need to wrap up, but maybe we can go back to the gallery view there. Susan, I don't know if I can do that or if you need to. Oh, I did that. Okay, I don't know if y'all have the gallery view. Any questions or thoughts from me?
Can you hear me? I have a quick question. I just
Who's
wondered,
that? Who's talking? I can't see.
Lynn.
Lynn,
Hey, Lynn. Yes. Yeah.
and I just wondered how soon in your life that your dad started telling his stories, and did he write them down, or did you write them down later?
We wrote some of it down. He started writing things down. That's a good question, Lynn, because a lot of these guys, they didn't talk much about it for years. My father taught me. I knew he was a POW. I saw him, visit with some friends when I was a kid. He told me some stories, but not much. And he didn't talk about it a lot. He had shot down one plane as a tail gunner. He shot down a ME-109. He had one confirmed kill in those missions. And I remember as a kid saying, well, did you kill him? Because, watching war movies and all. And my father got very somber when I said that, asked him that. And he said, well, I didn't see a parachute. And that was his answer to that. And so if any of you remember the movie High Noon, not High Noon, 12 O'Clock High, 12 O'Clock High, Gregory Peck, it's about the 8th Air Force. I watched that with him one time when I was a kid, and he talked about how the sounds were realistic. It sounded like the planes. It felt real. And I remember another time when the movie was coming on TV, and I said, Daddy, 12 O'Clock High is coming on. You want to watch it again? And he said, no, I don't. He did not talk about it until he was older. And when he was in his 70s, that's when he started going to the reunions. He never was interested in going to the reunions. And then he started really talking and writing things down. And toward the end of his life, I think it became very important that we know his story and that my sons know his story. Oh, by the way, I forgot to show you something. I was going to show you real quickly. Just an artifact here. Can you go back to Spotlight for just a second there, Susan? I'm sorry, but I wanted to show you all these. These are his dog tags.
Oh,
That's his
wow.
Army dog tag. You all know what that's all about. But this, if I can tilt it so you can see it, yeah, that's his Stalag 17 dog tag.
Oh, gosh.
And interesting thing to have, and I will always hang on to this, of course. And if you see, you know, it's perforated. So if something happened, if he died there in the camp, the Germans would have broken that in half,
Right.
kept part of it with the body, and sent the other half to the Red Cross. So anyway, I'd forgotten to show that, and I wanted to show that. So good question though, Lynn. I think a lot of those guys from World War II, it took years for them to start to talk about it, if they talked about it at all. So, all right. Anything else quickly?
I see. I think Melvin's talking. I
Melvin,
think
you're muted.
you got to unmute Bruce and Melvin.
Unmute there. Oh, yeah, there you go, Melvin. Go ahead. No, you're still muted. Wait a minute, Melvin. You're muted.
Try
That's
again,
He's
Bruce.
talking away. He's talking away here. Okay.
Okay.
There we
There
go.
we
All right,
There
now,
you go.
Melvin.
Yeah, you were muted. Oh, Mark,
Yeah.
you can't get rid of him, can you? No, I said you got a lot to be proud of with your dad, your father, and by the same token, he has a lot to be proud of too, knowing the service that you've given today.
Well, thank you, Melvin. I appreciate that. And he was always very proud of me in ministry. And,
Your dad and your mother, they brought you up right.
well, he was a good man. My father was a good man, and he loved meeting people. I wish, you know, that's the sad. I wish y'all could have met him. Because whenever he was with people, my father just dove in and had to find out everything about everybody. And he was just a people person. And I wish I could have known him. He would have been very proud that I was at Glenn Memorial too. He would be
Right.
very proud of that. But
Can you
I
hear
wish y'all
me?
could have met him.
No, don't think so.
Yeah, Linda, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to thank Mark for bringing this great story to us today and for taking the time to share it with us. So it brings what happened then to life for us. And that is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I hope it wasn't too much. Martha, did you start to say something? Oh, okay.
Hey,
All right.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that Leanne?
Hey, Mark.
Leanne?
Hey,
My cousin.
hey. I've never used Zoom, so I don't know if I'm doing it right.
Well, we're
And-
hearing you. We're not seeing you. So
Oh, okay. That's probably a good thing. I typed a message on the chat there.
Oh.
Can you see that?
let me pull it up.
No, keep getting
Oh,
phone
yeah,
number.
yeah. Said her grandmother said that they used to listen to Danny Boy and cried because they didn't know how or where he was at the time. And my mom, one of the kids, loved her Uncle Dan, who called her Punk. I'd forgotten that he called her Punk. Yeah,
Yeah.
Leanne's
When you said the
grandmother was
kid,
my
Yeah,
father's
that's
sister.
my mom.
Yeah, and yeah.
Helen,
Jamie.
Helen is my mother. Helen was named for Dan's sister. My mom is now an 80-year-old kid. And I know she would like to see this, Mark, and I hope maybe we can somehow get her a copy. I don't think she would know how to work Zoom. I didn't try to explain it to her because I had to figure it out myself. But she loved her Uncle Dan very, very much. And my grandmother, your Aunt Mildred, she used to tell me about how awful it was with them not knowing where he was.
Yeah.
And that they just loved their little brother Dan.
Yeah, he was the youngest of the bunch. but-
That's right.
Yeah.
My grandmother Mildred, your aunt, was the oldest.
Right. And it was interesting. Yeah, my Uncle Bill, who lived right next door to us in LJ when we were growing up, he had been in the Pacific, but was home during when my father was POW. And he told about how they had a bond drive there in LJ, and they had a little band that played for this bond drive, trying to get American people to buy bonds. And so he requested Danny Boy, that they play Danny Boy, the classic song. And they did, which my Uncle Bill was not above manipulating people. So.
Your dad loved, I remember your dad, he loved big band music, and we used to talk about it back when he was still around. I was pretty young at the time, but he did love that music from World War II.
All right. Well, Leanne, I'm glad you joined us. Thank you. Good to see you here.
I'm really glad I saw your notice about this because I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say about your dad. We loved Uncle Dan. He was a wonderful person.
Well, y'all, any other thoughts before we close it up here and we'll finish up?
But would you remind us again the name of the book?
I might say as a
Masters of the Air. Correct?
Yeah, Masters of the Air by Stephen Miller. Wait a minute, let me make sure I'm telling you the right name on the author. No, I'm sorry, Donald Miller. Masters of the Air, Donald Miller. It is a very good book. And as I say, they're basing that television series on that book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Mark?
Chuck, did you start to ask something?
yeah, I was just going to say that it's certainly a pleasure to meet some folks from Glenn, and I'm across the street, and I certainly will be attending. And one of these days, I will share a book I wrote called Once a Marine about experiences in Vietnam. So.
Oh, wow. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Chuck. I'd love to see that.
Wonderful. Yeah, Chuck, maybe we'll probably do something more for Christmas, for the holiday in December for our friendship group on Zoom. But I might touch base with you about the new year.
Well, I don't want to take a lot of time, but I'll tell you what it was about is that in the FBI, I got so tired of news commentators. A guy would have been a Marine in 1944, rob a bank in 1989. And the only thing the news wanted to say is former Marine robs a bank. So I found about 20 former Marines that the Marine Corps totally turned around, and they became very successful because of the Marine Corps. So it's kind of a fun read anyway.
Thank you.
That's great. That sounds interesting. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Were you in
we're
the
great.
FBI?
Glad to have you
Yeah,
join us.
25 years.
Okay.
That's great. Well, glad to have you join us. We look forward to getting to know you, Chuck, and glad to have cousin Leanne and Emma Rogers was here, a church member of Mark's from Hamilton Mill. I don't know if you knew she was on board.
Now I see your name there, Emma. Hey, Emma.
Oh,
See you there.
Susan,
Yes.
Susan, Melvin, maybe another Veterans Day, I'd be glad to do the same program on my 12 months in Korea.
We might get quite a few wars covered and conflicts covered. If we've got Vietnam with Chuck and Korea with Melvin. Yeah.
By the way,
Well,
I had an ancestor who was named Hume Field, and he was one of the great officers for the Southern Confederacy in the Civil War. I've got a good book about him too.
What was the name again?
Hume Field.
Hume Field. Okay.
That's great. And then glad to have Julia Ann on the call. Hopefully she could hear us. And not sure who Ed C was. You're on mute. Anyone know who Ed, if you can hear us there? Trying to see who that was.
Susan, when we have Melvin tell us about his time in Korea, be sure to let Jim Laney know, because Jim would love to hear that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
That's true. That'd be great.
Yeah, Jim could tell some interesting stories too, I know.
He has.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to be together on this Veterans Day. And again, thank you for those veterans on the call. It was a delight to see Don Bracewell with us, and Melvin and Chuck, and great to have, and many of you who have family members. So this is a reminder. Some of you have already emailed me photos of veterans. We are including those in the virtual worship on Sunday. If you can get that to me by tomorrow morning. We've got some great contributions of photos of family members that, and men and women who served in different ways. So send it over to me if you want to include that on Sunday. But we don't have to have the recording anymore.